They whispered her name in the fields long before the sun rose, a name that moved through the cabins like a chill on the back of the neck. Maria, a name the enslavers refused to speak aloud unless it was in fear, and a name the enslaved held on their tongues like an ember of forbidden hope. In the deep silence of Mississippi's soil, where suffering soaked into the ground like water that never dried, Maria walked as one whose spirit had been cracked but not broken, bowed but not erased. There was something in her eyes that did not belong to the plantation, something that refused to kneel even when her body was forced to. And those who watched her, those who labored beside her, knew that whatever lived inside her was dangerous enough to make the night itself lean forward and listen. They say the South in those days was built on terror, terror that the enslavers inflicted and terror that they feared might someday return to them. And in the midst of that world, where the whip wrote laws across human skin and children learned the meaning of cruelty before they learned their own names, there emerged the story of a woman who decided that fear would not be the master of her soul. She lived in a world where everything had been taken from her: her name, her choices, her dreams, her body, her freedom. But the human spirit has a peculiar way of surviving what should have destroyed it, and Maria learned early that inside her, a fire was waiting for its moment. She had watched too many nights when the moon bore witness to someone else's suffering. She had heard too many screams that dissolved into the darkness. She had felt too many days when the weight of injustice pressed so hard on her chest that she wondered how lungs could keep breathing. Maria's life was a collection of wounds hidden beneath the surface, the kind of wounds only the oppressed recognize in one another. And every wound taught her something the enslavers never imagined she would learn: that even a trapped soul can measure the cost of silence. What nobody knew was that Maria was counting. Counting the insults, the violations, the punishments, the labor that stole her strength and the grief that stole her sleep. Counting the sons she might have had, the dreams she might have lived, the mornings she might have woken without fear. Counting the days she endured and the days she survived. Counting the ways she had been broken and the one way she refused to be. It is said that when people are pushed beyond human endurance, they begin to hear a voice inside them, whether it is the voice of God urging liberation, or the voice of their own spirit refusing to die. That voice grew louder in Maria until there came a day when silence felt more dangerous than action, and obedience felt more poisonous than defiance. And on that day, the world that had tried to crush her learned that even the most oppressed human being can rise with a force no one sees coming. Those who lived on the plantation would speak of her story in fragments, each telling it differently, not because they disagreed on the facts but because they were afraid of the truth. Afraid of what a woman like Maria represented. Afraid of what her courage said about their own cowardice. Afraid of what her boldness revealed about the cracks in the system they worshipped. And above all, afraid that her spirit might be contagious, that someone else might rise like she did, someone else might look fear in the face and refuse to bow. But if you had been there in those days, if you had walked among the enslaved cabins late at night, you would have felt something shifting in the air. You would have heard the whispers floating between people who had never known power. You would have seen the way the atmosphere around Maria seemed to carry a tension, not of hatred but of awakening. She moved like someone who had stopped asking for permission to exist. She carried herself like a storm gathering its strength, steady and inevitable. And though the oppressors believed they controlled every breath she took, they failed to understand that true rebellion begins long before the first act of defiance. It begins in the mind, in the heart, in the secret place where a person decides that enough is enough. The enslaved had been conditioned to hide that place, to bury it, to protect it by disguising it. But Maria was done hiding. The world around her had already taken everything that could be taken. What remained belonged only to her. Her story was not just an act of resistance, it was a message, a sermon written not on paper but on the conscience of anyone who dared to listen. It asked questions the South did not want to answer. What happens when the oppressed refuse to carry the burdens assigned to them? What happens when the sufferer becomes the instrument of reckoning? What happens when a single woman decides that her life, even as broken as it had been, still contains enough dignity to shake the pillars of injustice? Maria's life forces us to confront the uncomfortable truth that every human being has a breaking point, and when that point is reached, the consequences can echo across generations. She did not wake up seeking vengeance, she woke up seeking humanity. She did not rise with the intention of destroying, she rose with the intention of reclaiming her selfhood in a world that denied she possessed one. And in reclaiming herself, she confronted the very structure that had long defined the borders of what was possible. There are stories in history that shock us, not because they are unbelievable, but because they reveal what people become when stripped of every other avenue of justice. Stories that make us examine our own moral instincts, stories that force us to ask, what would I have done if I were her? If I lived her life? If I bore her wounds? It is easy to judge a woman like Maria from the comfort of modern distance. It is easy to critique the choices of someone whose world we will never fully understand. But the deeper truth is that Maria's story is not about comfort, it is about confrontation. It confronts the cruelty of the past, the moral failures of a society built on bondage, and the devastating consequences of denying someone's humanity. She became a symbol not because she sought fame but because her actions shattered the illusion that slavery was sustainable. Her story circulated because the South needed a reminder of the fear that lived beneath its arrogance. Her legacy endured because those who suffered alongside her saw in her a testament to the human capacity to resist, to survive, and to reclaim power in the unlikeliest ways. Even now, when we speak her name, we are not merely recalling an event, we are engaging with a question that haunts the conscience. What does desperation sound like when it finds a voice? What does injustice look like when it meets its reckoning? What happens when the oppressed decide that the cost of silence is greater than the cost of action? And so we stand here today, speaking of Maria, not to glorify the violence of the past but to expose the violence that created it. We speak of her not to celebrate suffering but to remind ourselves of the lengths to which human beings will go when denied their God-given right to dignity. We remember her not as a monster, not as a villain, not as an anomaly, but as a mirror reflecting the brutal system that shaped her choices. Her story is not comfortable. It is not gentle. It is not the kind of tale we can wrap in soft language and walk away from unchanged. Her story confronts us with the reality that oppression breeds consequences, that injustice breeds resistance, and that even the most powerless person can become the instrument of a history-defining moment. Maria of Mississippi stands as one of those figures whose name lives in the shadows yet never fades. A woman whose suffering molded her, whose courage defined her, and whose actions forced a reckoning on a world that believed she had no right to resist. Today, when we speak her name, we step into a story that demands reflection, humility, and the awareness that every human soul carries a threshold where pain turns into purpose. And as we begin, we ask not for comfort but for understanding. Not for judgment but for clarity. Not for distance but for compassion. Because her story may belong to the past, but the lesson she represents, the cost of cruelty, the power of resistance, the fierce fire of human dignity, still speaks to every generation that dares to listen.